Bienvenue à tous, à toutes. Welcome, willkommen. It's my great pleasure to see so many of you for this exceptional opportunity to have Professor Esther Duflo with us tonight. To launch things off, I would like to introduce our rector, Frédéric Herman, who will say a few words, followed by our dean of HEC Lausanne, Marianne Schmidt-Mas. Frédéric.
Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. These words are not mine. I'm very flattered if you thought they were. But they've been pronounced by Barack Obama while he was running for president during the Democratic Party primaries. At the time, he had chosen Hopes and Change as his theme for his 2008 campaign. We all know the end of that story. Dear Professor Duflo, I've chosen this quote today not only because Barack Obama had appointed you in his advisory team well before you got your Nobel Prize, but mainly because these words resonate deeply with the essence of your work. A work of indisputable impact, and more importantly, a source of inspiration for change, and change for the better. We're all very honored to welcome you tonight at UNIL and feel privileged that you've agreed to give a lecture this evening. You are renowned and you've been rewarded for your pivotal work on poverty alleviation. In the realm of combating poverty, you've not only challenged conventional wisdom, but you've also reshaped our understanding of poverty and development. I can only praise you for your use of rigorous quantitative methodologies. I agree with you that Carl Friedrich Gauss was the greatest of all, but here we are fortunate enough to welcome you in an institution that has been built on the shoulders of scientists like Vilfredo Pareto or Léon Walras. Your use of randomized controlled trials has brought invaluable insights into the efficacy of various interventions, going from evaluating the impact of remedial education programs to scrutinizing the effectiveness of microfinance initiatives, or thinking about climate, the environment, or equal opportunity, like tonight. What is clear is that on these topics, your research has illuminated the path toward evidence-based policy solutions. It's also worth adding that your approach extends beyond mere numbers. You recognize the intricate web of social, economic, and cultural factors that perpetuate poverty. By combining quantitative analysis with a holistic understanding of communities, you've enriched our understanding of the multifaceted nature of poverty. To end, I'd like to emphasize one more time that it's indisputable that you use excellence to make change happen for the common good. That inspires me, and I guess it inspires many of us tonight. Thank you for your presence tonight, and I'm looking forward to listening to you and all the others this evening. Thank you very much, and I will let the Dean of the Faculty of HEC speak.
As the Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, HEC Lausanne, I'm extremely honored to welcome you this evening, Esther Duflo. We need more people like you. We live in a world where distinction between facts and fake is not so easy to maintain and becomes thus more and more important. It often seems to me that all opinions on all topics are seen as equally true and legitimate, and yes, everybody is entitled to their opinion. But if we need to take decisions as a society, we need to come up with policies that result in the changes we want to bring about. And here, opinions are not good enough. We need more science, we need more people like you. Science also is a broad field, and qualitative and correlational research have their place. And again, all researchers are entitled to the methods of their respective fields. But if we need to take decisions as a society, we need to know whether the policies we want to implement will bring the expected results. We need randomized control trials wherever possible, because only experimental designs, such as randomized control trials, inform us about causality, a prerequisite for testing the effect of a measure, treatment, or policy. We need more experimental research. We need more people like you. What should science be about? All researchers are entitled to freely choose their topic of research. But what are some of the most pressing questions as we as humanity face? Poverty, healthcare, education, equality. We need more researchers who tackle topics that concern us as a species. We need more people like you. What is the impact of science? Science should inform policy making, and you have brought about societal change with your research. But it's not only governments that should turn to your science, we as citizens should also. We as Swiss citizens, to give you an example, with our direct democracy, will have to vote very soon on a stop of immigration. And instead of listening to populist speeches, we should all read your and other economists' research in order to grasp the complexity of the question and to base our opinions on facts. We need more research that can inform us as citizens. We need more people like you. What I want to say is that you're an inspiring role model, not only for economists, but for all of us. Beyond your remarkable intellect and your academic accolades, your profound commitment to societal justice, equity, and to making real-world changes one evidence-based policy at a time are most impressive. I'm eager to listen to your talk, and thank you to be with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Frédéric. Just, some of my students are here, and I hear a lot that we need a revolution to tackle climate change. Okay, I agree, but my students are complaining that I'm a bit boring. I'm not teaching them how to do a revolution. So my answer to that is why we are organizing this conference tonight. The work of Professor Duflo and the pioneers of economics, Walras, Pareto, that were a long time ago, a century ago, professor here, gave us some tools to think how to do small revolutions. And so the work of Professor Duflo is all about this. This is an approach that is baby steps, data-driven. You pay close attention to institutions, and that lead to quiet revolutions. And this is exactly what we need to tackle inequality, global climate change, and poverty. So I would like you, especially my students, to pay close attention to what Professor Duflo has to say tonight and the debate with our outstanding panelists. And without further ado, please, Esther.
Bonsoir, good evening. I hope it's not going to be disappointing. I'm going to be talking a bit more about kind of big plans than I usually do, but I'll try to make it clear that they are based on some small baby steps underlying those. So I'm going to talk today about the problem of what we owe to the poor citizens of the world. And you can think of we as Europe and the US combined. So, and poor citizens in the world, you can think about the inhabitants of poor countries or the poor people in middle-income countries. So what do we owe them as a consequence of what is happening to the planet today? So something I don't need to remind you of, but I'll still do it. Climate change is not in the future; it is already with us. The last 12 months have been the 12 hottest months on record. There are already, for example, in Southeast Asia right now, there are many people who experience temperature of 45 degrees, 43 degrees Celsius that are not really compatible with human life. And these are phenomena that repeats themselves again and again. And it's not going to, no matter what we do at this point, it's not going to improve very fast in the coming years. Now, it is, of course, commonplace to say that the emissions that are responsible for this state of affairs are historically the result of the development path that was chosen or that was experienced in the countries that are today rich, like the US or Europe. But typically what you hear right after that is the idea that, well, yes, that used to be the case, but now look at China. That's really where the problem is. A country like China is a huge emitter, and then not far behind, we are seeing India arriving. So maybe it was true historically, but it isn't really true now. And what I want to start by pointing out is that if you compute emission correctly, this is actually not just in the past. And in fact, I am willing to let the past go, partly for pragmatic reasons. You will see a slide a little bit behind where John Kerry says the US will never pay reparations. And I think that's just a positive statement we need to take as given. So let's forget the past, but let's look today. And what I want to start with arguing is that even today, even though you have this graph that everybody has in mind that actually China is the second biggest emitter, it's not just about history, it's also about what is happening today. Why is that? Well, because the true carbon footprint is not just the carbon footprint that is emitted in the country, it's the carbon footprint that is emitted in the country plus whatever came in, emitted in the process of producing what you happen to consume in that country. So for example, if you drive your electric car on the highway of Switzerland, your total carbon footprint is not just whatever went into the production of the electricity that fuels that car, but also anything that involves the creation of that car. So putting it together, probably in China, this is the total carbon footprint, or people call it consumption carbon footprint as well. So this is, of course, the relevant measure, if we could compute it, of carbon footprint for each person, would include the production of goods and services that we are consuming. And some of these emissions, of course, are not produced in the countries where the goods are being produced. So if you look at a map, and you basically combine the emission in each country with the trade flows, you get a map like this, which is when a country is blue, it means it's exporting CO2 emissions. So it is producing stuff that are consuming by other people. And when a country is red, it is importing CO2 emission. And what you're seeing here, for example, is that, well, China is really blue. It's producing a lot of emission, but a lot of this is to produce the goods that we are consuming in Europe and the US. And the US is a huge carbon emitter. And Europe, we are feeling extraordinarily virtuous. Our emissions are going down and so on and so forth. But we are also big importers. So now, the issue is that when you've said that conceptually, it's nice, but in practice, how do you go about computing individual total carbon footprint? It's a bit hard. So you can't really do it for each individual. What you can do, and this is kind of not what I do for a living, so I'm taking that from, because it's had too many assumptions for me to tolerate doing it, but I'm very happy to read other people having taken this effort. What you can do is to combine survey data that tells you, for example, what we call the elasticity of emission with respect of the the total emission of the consumption bundles that you consume with respect to your income. So there are survey data where we know what people are purchasing. We can combine that with where those things are being built and how much emission were necessary to construct them. And with that, get a sense of, at various places in the income distribution, how much do people emit, total carbon footprint included. And then we can, once we have that, we can combine that with very good data that we do have, and particularly put together by the World Inequality Lab at Paris School of Economics. You can combine these estimates of how much people consume at various levels of income. The elasticity is not one, so people proportionally consume less, but the consumption bundle are actually less carbon intensive as people become richer, but not very fast. So as people become richer, they consume more and more and more and more, and therefore on balance they consume more. So what you can do is to combine this data on this kind of estimates of total carbon footprint for representative people at various levels of the income distribution with very detailed data on income distribution for the world, and get a sense of where are the big emitters and how much they are emitting. And you get so several teams have done that with different sets of assumptions, and nicely enough, they land more or less in the same place. So Lucas Chancel has one of those estimates in an article in Nature, and comes with a rule that's easy to remember. Is the 50-10 rule. So the 10% richest people, which are also mechanically in this model the 10% largest emitter, are responsible for 50% of global emissions. And kindly enough, it works in the other direction. It didn't have to, but it does. Which is the bottom 50% of emitters are responsible for about 10% of emission. You can see that the numbers are not exactly that. But it's easy to remember. It's a 10-50 rule, works both ways. So it's highly unequal. If you take, for example, and of course it also depends by country and by regions. So if you take the emission of total emission of an American in the top 10% of the income distribution, his estimates imply that they emit 122 times a poor African, or in fact an African in the middle of the income distribution in Africa. 122 times, that's a lot. So Bruckner is another team at the World Bank that comes up with very different assumptions, but very similar results. And of course, because there are more richer people in rich countries, the emissions, the big polluter happens to be mostly in rich countries, particularly in the US, but also in Europe. And in the whole continent of Africa, contribute very little to global climate change. That's another way to see this map, where you can see that I gave you the number for a poor African compared to a rich American. It's a ratio of 122. For sub-Saharan Africa, it's 0.6 versus 14.5 on average, the emission. So the first thing that this means is that there is actually no trade-off between eliminating extreme poverty, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals of eradicating extreme poverty, people living under $2 a day and a person. Because even if you did that, people would be so poor, even at $2 a day, they would really not contribute anything that is relevant. So for example, these are calculations by the Bruckner team, looking at the impact of eradicating extreme poverty, that's SDG 1, on emission, that would increase emission by 2%. So the idea that sometimes you have, okay, fine, we created this problem, but now we all have to work together to ameliorate it, it's kind of neither here nor there, because they have no margin. The very poor people are not emitting today. What are they going to do? There is no margin for them to emit less. the second thing that's related to this, how do you, to this inequality as a mirror image of inequality in terms of the impact that climate change has on people's life. And here one could look at various measures of impact. I'm going to focus, because that allows me to be very specific, on the risk of dying. So when it's very hot, so there are various reasons in which climate change might increase death, in particular catastrophic events and so on. I'm also not going to focus on that because it's hard to find out like what would happen in case of catastrophic events. I'm going to focus on just the effect of temperature per se, hot days, on human life. And the reason why it's helpful to focus on that is because even though climate change is still in the making, there has been variation in weather over time, and we can use those to get a sense of what are the impact of temperature econometrically. So let's think a bit about this issue of the impact of rising temperature on lives. By the way, these are books that I've written for small kids. There are 10 of them. They are about small kids living in a village in 8 poor countries. And there are about 3 or 4 of them that are focused on this question of environment. So they are beautifully illustrated by Shane Olivier. And in this, they are very hot. So it has a lot of implication, not just the death, but it's harder to learn, and there is no water, and so on. So what's the first problem? Well, the first problem is very mechanical. It turns out that countries that are poor today are in places where it is already hot. Why, we don't need to get into, but it's just a fact. A lot of the poor countries are in places that's already hot. You can see the northeast of Brazil. The Sahel region of Africa is, of course, super hot. The north of India, in particular, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia, are places where it's already hot today. Now, the planet is warming. It's not warming equally in all places, but even if we took that as a basic. If it turns out that it's warming by 2 degrees everywhere, the temperature is going to go on average from 20 to 22 in Lausanne and from 32 to 34 in Riyadh or in Faisalabad in Pakistan. And it turns out, obviously, that the effect of temperature on human health are not linear. They are not even monotonous. If you go from -12 to -10, that's good for you. If you go from 35 to 37, it's bad for you. In particular, where temperature really becomes not really compatible with normal human life is 35 degrees Celsius. Now, because those poor countries are in places where it's already hot, they are in places that already have days that are 30 or 31, and therefore they're going to get more hot days. That's mechanical. So in the next 20 years, there'll be more days that are above 35 degrees. This is kind of a heat map of number of extra days above 35 degrees in the world. And you can see, almost none of them in continental Europe, little bit in Spain. And even more by 2050, you're going to get even more very hot days. Look at Brazil, the north part of Brazil, the Sahel region of Africa, the north of South Asia, where you're seeing many of these very hot days being added. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the world, citizens of the world are not equal in our ability to face those very hot days. So I mentioned 35 are not very compatible to human health, but it is much easier if you have already experienced a hot spell. For example, when there was the first very big hot spell in France several years ago now, many people died because people had no idea what to do. And now in the future ones, then people didn't die because people knew to check on their grandmother and make sure they could go into a cool place or something like that. So habit helps because you learn from your past experience, but money also helps. So that's the intuition, that habit would help and money help, but how do you know that it's actually the case, and in particular, how much it's the case? So here I'm relying on the work of the Global Impact Lab. That's a group of economists who are at various universities, University of Chicago, Michael Greenstone, Berkeley, Solomon Cheng, Columbia, etc. They're all large group of people, got together and assembled data on micro-region on the history of temperature, as well as the history of mortality in micro-regions around the world. So you can see here on the map the regions that they're working with. So they have, of course, they have all of the US, they have Brazil, they have India, they have China, and within that is separated in many, many small places, so about 12,000 micro-regions. And what you have is the history of temperature. And the question you're asking is that, are you comparing, for example, within a region or within a country or even within a smaller set than a countries? Historically, if a particular district had more very hot days than another district in a particular year, do you see more people dying in that year? So it's not a randomized control trial, it's using the past, it's using historical variation in weather that are not random. We know they are on the trend, but the variation around the trend have some element of randomness. So that's the question they're asking. And then they're asking these questions, and they're asking how, so for each kind of subset of countries and regions, they can say what's the impact of more days at 20, compared to 20, what's the impact of more days at 25, 26, 27, 30, 35, etc. And what you get are these little graphs towards the 9 little graph on the right-hand side of the slide for me, left-hand side for you, where you're looking at basically the effect of temperature. The graphs are very small, so let me tell you what's on it. On the x-axis, you have the temperatures in degree, and it's asking, in those places where you have more hot days or less or more cold days, how does the mortality increase in a place that happens to have a few more of those compared to a neighboring place that doesn't? And so what you're finding is that, for example, if you focus on is there a light here? No. If you focus on the one, for example, all the way to the left, a poor place in a cold climate, when you have a lot of days above 35, that curve is very much to the right. Many more people die in years where it's there. You have more hot days, more of those hot days. So that makes sense. Generally, that's the shape of the curve. But then what is interesting is to see how the shape of the curve depends both on your on how much you've been exposed to heat in the past, which gives you experience and learning, and also how much money you have. And what you're finding is two things. Number one, places that are historically cold tend to have curves that are steeper on the right than places that are historically hot. That's because the hot places are adjusted. They were able to kind of learn how to deal with this. And then the second part is that places that are poor have much steeper curve at any level of historical experience, even for places that are hot today. If you take a places that is hot, they know what to do, but they are very poor. It's not clear they can do it. So the places that are poor and hot still have a steep curve compared to places that are richer and cold. So if you remember if you remember the curve, the map that I showed you a minute ago, they didn't have the whole world, but they are brave, very brave, and explore and extrapolate from the regions they do have to the whole world based on their experience with climate and their income to get something like that, this map, which tells you, well, you get more extra hot days. How many more people does that kill you in your particular place? And the redder it is, the more people are dying from hot days. And what you see is that, well, if it got super hot in Greenland, a lot of people would die because they really don't have too much experience with it, but then it won't get very hot in Greenland. But unfortunately, if it gets super hot in sub-Saharan Africa, people will also die, and there it will get super hot in sub-Saharan Africa. So now we have the first fact that sub-Saharan Africa is going to get more hot days, and so will the northeast of Brazil, and so will the northern part of South Asia, Pakistan, North India, etc. And we know how much people will die as a result of these hot days. We can put the map together, and we get a pretty remarkable map, which is how much, where would we expect people to die and more of as a function of hotter temperature. That is just hotter temperature. So none of that, remember, because we are dealing with history, there have not been any catastrophes. It's just the average effect of hot days. So it doesn't include flood, drought, or other disasters, which might be bad also for rich countries. So this is just temperature. And you can see that temperature are going to kill people outside of the rich countries, literally outside of the OECD. And so the estimate, you have a basic estimate, that's the white line for rich countries. For example, you see for Accra here about 100. But of course, the climate models come with a lot of uncertainty. Those estimates come with their own standard error. So they also provide us with nice distribution of how good or bad it might become. And there is a pretty big range. In the bad scenario, in Accra, it could be an extra 1,000 deaths for every 100,000 people. So these are how they are distributed. It's very visual on the map that this is basically in poor countries, and particularly in very poor countries. For example, the Sahel region of Africa is one of the most affected, as is Pakistan. So on average, what do they find when they calculate how many deaths we can expect? We can expect an increase at the current scenario, the RCP 8.5, kind of business as usual scenario. You can expect an increase. They estimate that there might be an increase in 73 deaths per 100,000 people. Just in case that doesn't look very much, that's 6 million a year. And that's as much as all of the deaths from infectious diseases combined today, as well as all of the deaths from cancer. So it's kind of a lot. That's the average. All of that I already showed you are coming from low-income countries, nothing from high-income countries. In fact, high-income countries will benefit because more people will die in summer when it's hot, but fewer in winter when it's cold, because rich countries tend to be in cold places. We also can see that mitigating to even RCP 4.5, a sort of moderate emission scenario, would basically eliminate all of this. So this is something that we can, in principle, still deal with. But if we don't, and you take these numbers, what do we, as rich countries, owe to this poor country citizen due to our decisions, consumption decisions that we are consuming? And once we know how much we owe, is it possible to spend this money? First to raise this money, and then I'll talk to you about to spend this money. And this is where I'll be on the firmer ground of the experimental work. But first, let's calculate how much this owe. It's not easy, because you could say, well, this is not our problem. And in fact, if you take today the social cost of carbon that is being used in the US, considers exclusively domestic impact of climate change. So one possible answer is we owe nothing. So I'm going to contend that's not the case. And do a simple calculation, simple, maybe potentially contentious, but important, because it's going to allow us to kind of put a number. So some of you may not be familiar with the concept of the value of a statistical life. And it's kind of a weird concept because, of course, there is no value to human life. But yet, there is a number that is used quite commonly to make decisions about various public investments. So, for example, the Environment Protection Agency uses a number that ranges between 7 million and 10 million, depending on their use. So what is it used for? Well, suppose you are building a highway and you are considering adding an entrance that is more secure than the one you were planning for. That's going to cost money. It's going to save some life. Someone is going to calculate the value of this life saved versus the money. And if the money is above, they are going to do it. I'm not necessarily defending this as something that is necessarily easy to understand, but it's just to say that this is something that we are using all the time. We value lives in our kind of, maybe not you in your day-to-day job, but there are people who in their day-to-day job value lives. So my first point is that, like, let's do that, but let's use the same valuation of life for everyone in the world. So if we take the US 7 million, let's take 7 million. 7 million for a whole life, you can kind of convert it into the price for each year of life saved. And then consider the cost of sending a ton into the atmosphere. That ton is going to have an impact on warming the temperature. This we are taking from the IPCC climate model. That temperature is going to have an effect on excess mortality that we are taking from those estimates I just showed you. And then we are multiplying that by the appropriate value of a statistic as life at a discount rate. This is all happening in the future. And it gives you a number for what is the cost of a ton of carbon. And that number, I'm explaining the calculation to you, but that number I'm taking from Michael Greenstone's work. And he says that's $37, based on the calculation I just did. So now what I do is that I take the $37 and say, fine, now let's multiply it by the total emission, not just the emission in the country, but total emission. It's very important for Europe. It makes a difference. That's about 14 billion ton of CO2 per year. Multiplied by that 37, that gives you that number of $518 billion per year. So my point is that that's how I would say, I contend this is like a pretty good estimate of the cost of our emissions in terms of life, just in terms of life. Then in discussions with others, for example, Michael Greenstone, he says, why do you stop with lives? You could use the total social cost of carbon, include the cost on energy, on agriculture, on labor, etc. I said, yes, possibly. But let's take lives. It's pretty, it's pretty stark that we are literally killing people, future people, and this is illustrating how much this imposes, how much money that represents. So we arrive at this kind of nice round number of about $500 billion a year. So my contention is we owe that money, we being US and Europe. Are we kind of working on giving it away? Well, not too fast. So this is the climate. John Kerry used to be the climate ambassador. Clearly, he doesn't think that it's a huge deal. Again, he's talking about reparation, so he's talking about the past. But still, do we have, so he's talking about the past, do we have any evidence that in fact we are good at providing common public good in the world? So just for comparison to this $500 billion, the US foreign aid is about $50 billion. So we are $50 million, so we are per year. So we are not there at all. So do we, what's the experience with COVID, which is another example in a sense of kind of a common, not something we did to them, it just happened, but it happened to the whole world. Lockdown happened to the whole world. Richer countries immediately started doing whatever it takes kind of policies and spent about 27% of their portfolio in fiscal stimulus measures towards their constituents. So at the time of the very beginning of the pandemic, I wrote an article in The Guardian with Abhijit Banerjee to say, fine, kind of anticipating something like that would be done and saying, well, we should, whatever it is, we should do the same with poor countries to help them, because the experience from history is that even after war or disaster or stopping the economy, economies can really catch up quickly if they have the resources to do it and converge right back to where they were. But this didn't happen. So when rich countries spent about 27% of their GDP in fiscal stimulus measures, poor countries spent 2% of their GDP in fiscal stimulus measure. To give you a sense of what it would have meant to arrive, say, at the same level as a fraction of GDP, I calculated that if the US had wanted to bankroll the whole sub-Saharan Africa to 27% of GDP, this would have cost them 10% of what they actually spent on fiscal stimulus measure on COVID. So they added, if they had added 10%, not nothing, but not so hard. If they added 10% to what they were spending anyways, they could have brought all of sub-Saharan Africa to 27%, but they didn't. So the spending was much lower in poor countries. As a result, or maybe partly as a result, the economy didn't really restart very quickly in poor countries, compared in particular to the richer countries. And then, of course, there is a story of vaccinations. The vaccination arrived remarkably fast in rich countries. They didn't really move to poor countries till much later. So we can't really. What this taught me is that we can't really count on the ability of rich countries to kind of step up in face of a crisis. We need to kind of get going in advance when we still have time and we can think about this problem in a cold, rational way. Because in presence of a crisis, it's just impossible for leaders vis-à-vis their opinions to say, well, we are going to not only borrow to the wazoo to support ourselves, but we're also going to send a bunch abroad. So, of course, it's been progress. There is a loss and damage fund, which is precisely designed to have money for poor countries to help them adapt to the climate. It was voted at the COP28 last fall. However, the US and Europe really insisted that contribution had to be voluntary. Fine, it's not surprising. I don't want to assume a liability that you don't even know the size of. So I'm not blaming them from that, but what is the size of those voluntary contributions? Right now, it's $700 million. There is $700 million in a fund where you would really need $400 billion a year. These people have their calculation for what is needed in a different way. They arrive at $400 billion, quite similar. So right now, there is no money in the loss and damage fund. I don't see any money coming into the loss and damage fund per, business as usual. So something has to change. Another example we have is that there was a pledge at the Copenhagen COP that countries would get money to do, that there would be money for poorer countries. The pledge was $100 billion a year. That pledge was never met. And then to the extent it was met, it was mostly loans. You can see the red is loans. It was mostly loans. And it was mostly for mitigation. So those $100 billion that were never $100 billion were 70 to 80% loans towards mitigation projects. That means projects that are meant to reduce emission, which are fine, they should be done, but they are not helping the countries that does them any more than us. It's just, an emission is an emission. So this is like neither here nor there from the point of view of the moral debt of $500 billion that I discussed. So how do we go about that? So various people have various opinions about how it should be done. My point is that whatever we do, we should have funds that are new. So nobody has already spent them. Nobody has a claim on them. And they are dedicated to this fund. So what are the possibilities that I have in mind? The first one is a modest increase in the taxation on multinational corporations that was agreed by over 100 countries in the world, and that is now already implemented since January by a little over 30 countries, is already in place. So what is this what is this rule? It was long in the making, and it was really transformational. It is really transformational in the sense that it's all the countries actually coming together on a rule for common international taxation. This gives me a lot of hope that, okay, it is possible to come up with systems, international systems. So in that right now it only affects the largest of the multinational corporations. 100 to 200 firms are concerned by it. And the amount was set at 15%. The original proposition by France and by the US was 21. So my suggestion is, okay, how about we increase it from 15 to 21? Clearly, it's not a radical proposition since we started from that. And take those 6% and allocate it to this fund. How much would that raise? That would raise, if it was really well done and done by all the countries, according to the EU Tax Observatory at BSE as well, it would raise an extra $300 billion compared to the current situation. So that's already a good chunk of the money that we need. If you went from, and then if it was not, if only the EU did it, and you could still get a part of it. And so if only the EU did it and it did some compensation, cross-border adjustment, etc., you could get $200 billion. So that's a good part of it. And then the second half of it, so we have about half of it, is this proposal by Gabriel Zuckman that they came up with in October and then got taken on board by the Brazilian presidency of the G20 in February and was endorsed both by the Brazilian finance minister and by the French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, to tax the 3,000 richest people in the world. 3,000, not very many. And to tax them at a very reasonable level, to tax them 2% of their wealth. To give you a sense of why this is very reasonable, is because most of these very, very, very high wealth tax earners don't pay any income tax because the taxes, instead of being the income that they are making on the wealth, they might pay income tax on their salary income, but typically they don't have much of a salary income. But the income that they made from the wealth that is being invested is reinvested, and therefore it never comes out, and it never takes the form of taxable income. So this is a point that Warren Buffett made and Politico made by investigating the question. In the Politico article, there was an interesting note, for example, of Jeff Bezos, who in a particular year not only paid no income tax, but had such a low income that he was able to claim the family tax credit, and he got it. So this is now something that's really, as people become aware of that's, okay, come on, like we all pay income taxes. They can pay income taxes on the income generated from their wealth. And think of a 2% wealth tax as really a 30% income tax on assuming that the average return on a large portfolio is easily 6%. So if they're making 6% on their wealth, 2% is about a third of that, 30% imposition of you on the income for your wealth. In fact, in the proposal, it says it's actually framed as an income tax. It says you should pay an income tax at least 2% of your wealth. So if someone already pays an income tax through the 2% of their wealth, they wouldn't pay that in addition. But it would kind of come up to an alternative minimum calculation that says you should at least pay 2% of your wealth in income tax. That proposal, if you implemented it, would raise about $250 billion a year. And there we go. 250, 300 from the increasing the tax on corporation from 15 to 21. And another 250, 200 if Russia doesn't play, but with a tax on the 3,000 richest people in the world, and you have the fund. So the point is that it's not that hard. It's not revolution. This is kind of, building on what is already there, an instrument that is already there, at levels of taxation that are very conventional, and as far as this one is concerned, really fixing a loophole. But the nice thing that the loophole was there this whole time is that that money hasn't been claimed yet, and we can therefore use it for this purpose. So is it possible? Well, so I was Gabriel Zuckman went to the G20 in February to present this proposal. I went to the G20 just last week. So his proposal was how to tax the super rich. My proposal is how to spend the money. And the Minister of Finance of Brazil has really kind of taken it, decided that this is what they want to push, and they are really hoping to reach a communiqué on that by the end of their presidency in July. Whether or not it's going to happen or not, I don't know, but at least this is now kind of in the open, discussed. The minister of the G20 heard it, and this is a good start. Now, there are many things that might stand in the way. So one thing that, basically three things. One is countries can say, well, country can agree on having a minimum tax or even taxing the billionaire, but might want to keep the money. It's another thing to raise money and then send it abroad. Another set of problem is that, what does it have to do with climate change? It's not a carbon tax. Why don't we have a carbon tax instead? So let me take this thing a little bit. So the first thing is that, and that's very important, is not everybody has to do it. It's not something where if everybody doesn't do it together, it will fail. For example, if you take the minimum tax on corporation, since January it's implemented by, I think, 37 countries, and it just happens. It works. It raises less money than it would otherwise, but it works pretty well, especially since you can always tax a little more. The firms that make money elsewhere, and you want to reach the minimum taxation for them. So, and in fact, creates kind of a bit of friendly competition for everyone to raise their taxes. Otherwise, the companies are paying the tax, but you're not getting it. So you could start that. Of course, this is a bit of protectionism. Ralph can talk to us more about that later. But many of the things that countries do are some form of protectionism anyways. The second problem potentially is this idea that, okay, you raise the money, but then people will never agree that the money leaves the country. And here, first I want to say this already happens. We do send rich countries spend money to the IMF, they spend money to the World Bank, etc. Secondly, it's important to note that this is a tax that is extraordinarily popular. And not because all taxes are popular. In general, when you ask in opinion polls where people would like to see an increase in taxes, they're like, no. Even if it's an increase in taxes on people who are very rich, and they will never pay it. But this one, there is work by Adrien Fabre and a team around him that ask various citizens around the world what they think about various proposals for fighting climate change. And one of the questions they're asking is a global tax. This is the last line here, the global tax on millionaire to fund low and middle income countries. Note we are talking millionaire. And the millionaire is very poor compared to the billionaire and compared to the largest corporation. So presumably people would be even more in favor of a more progressive tax. Even that, when it's framed like that, 69% of Americans think it's a good idea. 84% of Europeans think it's a good idea. People are generally quite favorable. And another question they ask is, suppose there was a millionaire tax, how much of this tax would you be willing to send to low-income countries? And people say about a third. So maybe I can't take all the 500 billion from these two taxes. Maybe we can take only a third of it. That would already be great. That would really be a complete game changer in terms of how much resources are available to protect people. Then the last little problem is that it's not really a carbon tax, so I want to say two things there. First, the more people consume, the more they produce carbon, so that as a kind of automatic carbon tax. And secondly, you could make it a bit more carbon tax-y by, for example, giving rebate to firms that are doing, that have a very clean carbon report card, assuming you would be able to do that well, which we are not really able to do it today. In my last 4 minutes, I want to say how this money would be spent. Also remember that the framing was all about compensation for loss of life. But you cannot really compensate people once they are dead. So we cannot, in terms of the use, we have to change the use and say, well, what's the best use of this money? Related to the climate, presumably, it's sort of a natural way to think about this, is how to help people not die. Basically, spend the money the most effective way possible to prevent people from dying due to the impact of higher temperature and other climate disturbance. So how would we do that? So at one extreme, some people, for example, Thomas Piketty says, well, you know, this money or any money raised internationally really belongs to poor countries. It needs to be shipped to foreign government, to this government, and they should be able to spend it the way they want. That's one extreme. At the other extreme, there is the sort of the US or the European Union view that, oh, they can't do it, they can't be trusted with the money, we have to put it in the World Bank that has rules and will be able to spend it. So in the COP28 negotiation on the loss and damage fund, the loss and damage fund almost didn't happen because of fight over these issues. The poor countries wanted the money for themselves. After all, it's their money. The rich country wanted the fund to live at the World Bank. The rich country won. The fund is at the World Bank, but it has no money anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference. So my proposal would be to kind of, so this is actually a huge issue in terms of getting consensus around anything like that. And my proposal would be to try and cut in the middle of the problem and say, well, let's think not first how it would be governed, but what would we do with it? And then, you know, how do we do with it could be arranged. And there I see basically 3 buckets. The biggest bucket would be to send it straight to people. So again, because that sidestepped the question of should it go to government, should it go to the World Bank, we now have, and that's where finally my 30 years of 20 years of JPAL work is coming. We have considerable evidence coming from many, many different researchers that people do extremely good use of money they receive. There are dozens and dozens of RCTs showing that when people get money, they spend it well, their nutrition improve, they improve their house, they, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that this is a good policy. And also, it's very cheap. The overhead on sending money to people is now close to zero because almost everyone is within reach or can be within reach, some little investment work is needed, of a bank account to which a direct transfer can be pumped. Either through their cell phones. In Africa, almost everyone has something called like a cell phone level wallet, or through bank account. In India, that's the route they took. Almost everyone has a bank account. And the payment-to-payment system, the payment systems are in good shape. These are really considerably improved, and it can be built to reach really everyone. So then the first thing you could do with, if you had that much money, is to agree to some rules that would be really parametric in saying, well, you have a certain number of days that are hot. Everyone in that region, small regions, you would create small regions, you say it's getting hot in that region. Everyone in that region gets a transfer that corresponds to a minimum standard of living. So a basic income for a period of time corresponding to the heat part. Or there is a drought, or there is a flood, or something like that. You can even do one better than that. There is research, for example, by Stefan Derken and others, showing that if the transfers are anticipatory, so if, for example, you expect a flood, or you expect a drought, which we are now able to do better, you can send money to people in advance. And there they can, they can move, they can put their cow above ground, they can go to the city for some time, and the research shows that the money, if it's received in advance of the event, is much more protective, both in terms of lives and in terms of livelihood. So that could be one big bucket. Another bucket could be the part of the adaptation work that people cannot do individually very well, or can be done more efficiently collectively. A big one is air conditioning, cooling. It's kind of, even if I give you a small transfer, cooling your house is going to be a bit of an issue. Or some place could become completely uninhabitable, so people will have to move and be accommodated elsewhere. So for this, the adaptation work is being done by the collective. So for example, cities can have places where they cool people. Cities will have, build dams so that people don't get flooded, and so on and so forth. And there again, you could say, well, let's have kind of rules where when it's hot or when you expect an event, local communities would get block grants that they could spend on whatever it is they want to spend. Again, very little overhead. And we have actually do have evidence as well that local communities spend money well. And the third one, and I guess that's Switzerland is the paradise of insurance and reinsurance, is a budget. This would be transfers to the poorest governments, but particularly in the very, very low-income countries. If you remember the graph I gave you, the map that shows that poor countries were able to spend 2% of their GDP in fiscal stimulus measure, it's not because they didn't want to do it. It's because the poor countries cannot go to the international market and say, hey, will you lend me money? Because nobody will lend them money. Their credit rating is too low. So they were unable to do that. Likewise, what happens when there is, so the private insurance markets work extremely poorly in poor countries with poor people for any number of reasons, particularly obviously for disastrous situation. So when something happens, ultimately it's almost always the government that steps up with their own resources that they don't have. So this is when they borrow or they just don't do it. So kind of a third big use of the fund could be, again, have rules to say, well, in such and such situation, the temperature is like that, low income, IDA, eligible countries, what I'm thinking about, because the other have the ability to raise funds or to subscribe their own insurance, could access like a block transfer. So this is kind of how I would spend the money. This is the place where that is actually kind of maybe based the most on my own work to see how money can be efficiently used by people or by community. So in conclusion, why do that? Well, why even spend time thinking about it? So first of all, I think it's a moral debt. I don't think it's really a choice. But even if you don't like that idea, there are two kind of more less normative and more positive view to think about that. The first one is that poor countries are just so fed up. And I think in particular the failure to share the vaccines has been extraordinarily damaging to the willingness of poor countries to do anything to really help rich countries in whatever their agendas are. And we saw it, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and African countries and India mostly sat on the side and say, well, whatever, your problem. And that's, of course, going to be a big issue as far as climate is concerned. Although they don't emit, the poor countries, they have a lot of natural resources that are protecting us, for example, forests and so on. And if you want everyone to be rowing in the same direction, I think it's going to become really critical to show some amount of realization of the extent to which we are still imposing this cost. The third one is related to that, which is that, again, right now, if you are a poor country or if you are a middle-income country, the best you can do to protect your people is to, number one, become rich as fast as possible, no matter the cost on the environment. And number two, acquire energy as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible, again, regardless of the cost of the environment. So we saw that in the COP, I think it was 26, when India, at the very last minute, there was a Glasgow COP, I think it was 26, maybe 27, at the very last minute refused to sign, didn't sign the text that was talking about moving away from coal. And China and India kind of didn't sign the text, and the text changed, and there was no mention of moving away from coal. And what they explained is that, well, we have to have energy because in the future, because of climate change, our energy needs are exploding. So unless you have other ways to protect people, and unless you have other ways to ensure these poor countries that you will you have their back and you will help them protect their people, then this mitigation effort will fail. And it will be a huge shame because some of these countries would engage into paths that are very, very costly to reverse, that we've engaged in, but we didn't know any better, and now we would know any better, and we need to avoid that. So that's where I will leave it for now. Thank you very much, and I will finish with, I'll just finish with my efforts. This was just what I was saying. So this is why I spent the time in the G20 getting the billionaire to pay up. Thank you.
Prize for Society Center, former president of the Paris School of Economics, and also former chairman at the Swiss National Bank. Welcome, Jean-Pierre Dantine. And now I'll invite also 3 more panelists that will enrich the discussion tonight by bringing their expertise on international collaboration and international organizations. First, I'm going to invite Özge Aydoğan, who is the president of the Sustainable Development Labs at the UN in Geneva. Well, director. Not yet. Thank you. I don't have the slides. Then Professor Gilles Carbonnier, who is Vice President of the International Committee of the Red Cross and also Professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Please welcome Gilles Carbonnier. And finally, Professor Ralph Ossa, please, who is the Chief Economist and Director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division at the World Trade Organization. Welcome. And now I'll give the floor to Professor Dantine, please.
Thank you, Quentin.
Oh, I forgot something, sorry.
You forgot about the,
about the questions.
the questions. Yes.
Something very important. I said that it was a dynamic discussion, and we really want to hear about all of you, about your question, and try to link them here. So you can do it as I will do it now. You can scan this code or go on the website menti.com and add the codes that you see here. So let me do it at the same time to be sure that we have the time. You can connect. And you'll get a screen where you can add your question. We'll try to filter, I'll try to summarize the numerous questions that we are probably going to get, but please participate, and we are looking forward to hearing your voice. Thank you. Please,
Okay, thank you, Quentin. We have a bit of time, but we have a lot to talk about. And I must admit, I structured the discussion a little bit ahead of knowing what Esther was going to say, and now I'm hesitant. I'll try to do it, but we'll feel free to embark on comment and appreciation of what Esther said. So I'll start still the way I thought we could do it, which is taking account of the fact that we have 1,800 students of Sebastien in the room, if I understand well. We should talk a little bit about economics. And one way to do it is to accede to the vows of Esther and say, no, suppose for a moment that we have this financing. Okay, we'll come back to the big issue. How do we collect the resources? But suppose we have them, we have these resources, and there was 3 proposals as to how to spend it. Could you, Esther, tell us a little bit, again, a bit of the economist talk, how your program evaluation work, or your methodology that you have initiated and that you have very successfully applied could help us go further into asserting what is it that we would want to do with the money.
Yeah, so for the part that's about individual transfer, I think we already know a lot. And we know a lot based on like an accumulation of randomized controlled trials. There haven't been 1 or 2 or 7, but potentially dozens, showing that people who receive cash transfers do not stop working, use it to buy food exactly as if you were to give them food, use it to improve their house, use it to invest in businesses when it's enough money. This might not be enough money because that's so. And then we have that research that I cited about the anticipatory transfer being even more effective. So we have a lot of data on that already. That's why you could use, I'm pretty confident that we could spend a lot of money in a way that we know to be efficient. And the work of JPAL, but also Give Directly, which is this kind of NGO that distributes money around the world, has shown it. And not only at small scale, but also at large scale. For example, during the COVID crisis, the government of Togo basically from scratch established a transfer program to support people who were affected by lockdown. And they established the program from scratch, and they wanted to be able to slightly target it. They found ways to target it based on satellite data. There was an experiment that was done in the process, or in the middle of COVID, when they had their new program. They ran an experiment of various ways to target, using either satellite data combined with cell phone metadata to identify poor region and poor people within these regions, versus the traditional method of doing a full household survey versus something in between. And they found that the cell phone metadata is just, the satellite data plus cell phone metadata is as good as anything else, and it is essentially free. So that's an example of the research happening in the meantime. If we go back if we go to the third point about reinsuring governments, this is more of a macro question, but that's related again to a huge micro and in particular experimental body of work that shows that private insurance don't work. That there is that people, that it's too much full of holes, too much basis risk for people to actually want to buy it. And at actually fair price, they don't want to buy it. But if only they could buy it, they would actually do well with it, but they don't want to buy it. And we can't make this market work. And therefore, ultimately, it's the government is the insurance of last resort. The interesting bucket is the one. So in these two, you could see, you could still have experiment as you go, and you should keep a lot of money, keep some money aside for experimenting and you go. On these various, for example, for the transfers question, on these various, I call them sometimes plumbing questions. How much money you should give, and who should authorize it, and what are the, with, for example, a problem with due to the climate might be today, but also in the future, because if it's been hot enough, all of your fields are completely burnt, you cannot go back, so there is a bit of persistence. The transfer might need to be adjusted for that. So a lot of research will need to happen as you go to make it work better, but already we have the basis. The middle bucket, the one about the adaptation effort that are supported by community, is actually one where we have almost no evidence, very little, because for whatever reason, the climate work has had no interest in adaptation. And the only way they're thinking, the world of climate thinks of adaptation as something that will make climate shock less costly, but not as actually a thing that people should be doing. So the research on adaptation, I know it very well because I'm writing a handbook chapter with others on this very question. And it's going to not be a very long chapter, because the research on adaptation is very limited. There is really very little we know. So there you could see that actually in that bucket of adaptation, you would combine spending money on what we know is effective. There are a few things, but also reserving a lot of money for people to experiment with things. So the fund could learn as it goes. So, for example, I chair in Paris a fund called the Fund for Innovation and Development, which has a budget of a few million euros every year given by the French government. Anybody can apply around the world. And they come up with an innovation, and they can ask for $20,000, or they can ask for $4 million to evaluate the impact of their innovation. But the key is that you have to be ready to evaluate what you're doing, either at a small scale or at a medium scale or at a large scale. And I think a big part of the money might want, across this tree, but particularly in the middle where we have so little evidence, can be used to build that evidence and also to make sure that whatever has been shown to be effective is then spread to other places. I didn't want to spend too much time preaching for my parish, but my parish is ready to accept donations.
Thank you very much, Esther. Else, what do you, Özge, sorry. How would you, you work with the SDG Lab. You're not president, right? But you're the director?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. What, from your perspective, this notion of innovation, of social innovation, technology, and in the spirit of what Esther said, how would you take a stand on this?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question, also for inviting us to the conversation tonight. For those who know the lab, we are a bit of a disruptor, so some of the things I might say might resonate, some of them might not resonate, but it's really about sharing some thoughts, sort of giving you a bit of an aspect, a glimpse into the kitchen of what we're cooking. And this question of social innovation, thank you for asking, is really a key one, because as you can imagine, there's a huge competition in innovation, obviously on funds, but what actually innovation means. And I would argue there's a big focus on innovation in terms of hardware. I've been, living and working in the space of development cooperation for a very long time, in banks, in governments, in the UN, and I can see how there's so much more traction for activities that are, related to sort of what is tangible. But truth to be told, and one of the key topics today is climate, but interconnected poverty, economy, rethinking economy as well. it's a lot about mindset shift, and that's actually about social innovation. So at the lab, we sit within the Director General's office. That's what we're focusing on at the SDG lab. And I'm often asked, so what is actually social innovation? To be frank, I've been trying to find the definition myself. There's so many, but there's no, I would say, one single. For me, it's really about, again, bringing sort of an incentive change that is needed to do things differently. I want to pick up maybe on one point that Esther brought up, which I really appreciated, on this question of what do we owe? And it's also a question we have been exploring quite a bit at the lab, but maybe a bit of a different spin to it, because when you talk about sustainable development, which is the thematic focus that we have, there's a lot of focus on sort of the geographical spillover effects, right, which was part of a question that I received. But my question is, when we speak about what do we owe, there's of course a lot of inequality imbalance between geographies, but what about the temporal dimension? So what do we owe, for instance, future generations? And I think for those who have been maybe following a bit what's happening to the overall sustainable development agenda, you know, with the different processes that are happening at the intergovernmental level leading up to the Summit of the Future, this aspect of future generations, next generations, accountability has been a very key one. So I would love to explore that question with you as well, because that's what we're looking into. So what is our, in that sense, debt to the future? And again, Esther, you said it, how do we quantify something like this? And once we know, how do we act on it? And I believe one of the aspects, and that's the second one, so I spoke about accountability. The other aspect is also what drives people to go about change. And I know we talk a lot about evidence, and I believe in evidence myself. I also did go to economics school. But you know, life has also taught me that we are all human beings in the end of the day, and there's one thing, and interesting enough, particularly in the area of climate change and climate science that's coming up, is about the impact of emotions. And I think on that, the evidence is also quite actually thin. But interesting enough, and we talked about this, because we are really a space where, you know, we are a policy space. So in my daily job, I interact all the time with ambassadors, government representatives. They're actually in charge of changing policy, acting on policy, implementing, designing policy. And oftentimes these people are really driven not only by data, not only by all the control trials we do, but in fact, some of the sentiments they have, how they feel, how they're impacted. And I would argue this aspect of what's being coined as effective sciences and how we explore that for change, especially on climate, is also extremely important. So I leave it here.
Thank you very much. And I think, I mean, of course, the lecture of today was an illustration, right? We talk about science, we talk about, but we could feel the emotions, and I think there's a way to share that emotion inevitably in this kind of discourse. Okay, we'll go back, we'll continue on this topic, but I would also want to still go back to the first question. How do we aid the resources? And we talked about taxation, and Gilles has been working on that. So maybe, Gilles, I would like to give you the floor and tell us first what is your appreciation of the proposal, of their feasibility, and maybe complete it with your own work on corporate taxation, which is probably very complementary to what Esther has said.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Pierre. And well, I cannot stress enough the importance of the proposal that Esther, you've been doing, because I think, as you mentioned, there is also heightened tensions globally between the West and the rest, or the global South. And we see also a lack of trust in multilateral organization. And I think that restoring a global taxation system that is seen as perceived and being transparent, equitable, and fair and effective is really at the source of restoring more trust in multilateralism. And what you mentioned in terms of what are the billions that are needed to compensate, but also to act both, especially on climate adaptation, is key. If I may just add, you might know the Global Adaptation Index of Notre Dame University shows permanently that the majority of countries that are most affected and have less resources are countries affected by armed conflict, by fragility, and a high level of armed violence. So this is countries where the International Committee of the Red Cross, of course, is mainly working, and we don't see climate adaptation finance flowing to these countries. At the last COP, we have seen a resolution to say let's try to flow more money there. Some of these jurisdictions are are under sanctions. So there is the trick of how do we channel actually adaptation funding to these jurisdictions under sanction, and there are ways and means. We have carved out humanitarian exemptions, and I think especially for climate adaptation, this is a question of survival. This is a question of being able to remain on the earth where they live. And at the global level, I think that the figures we have heard at midterm review of the SDGs by the Secretary General of the United Nations is that we need $3 trillion a year to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And out of these 3 trillion, 2 trillion might be domestic resources and 1 trillion international resources. And as present, foreign aid covers less than 10% of the total. So also enabling developing countries to mobilize domestic resources is absolutely key. And what you propose will certainly contribute to that. We have seen the end of last year, a resolution by Nigeria adopted at the UN General Assembly to have the UN working on a global tax treaty, and to have some of these conversation moving from the OECD to the UN, where developing countries would have more say on what type of systems would be more adapted to their needs and their capabilities in terms of taxation and in terms of what they can do. And one part of it is really increasing indeed corporate tax revenues. And what we see is that there is a lot of issues related to tax avoidance, related to trade mispricing. And our research has shown that, for instance, trade in gold or trade in essential commodities exported by commodity exporters is often misinvoiced, is under-invoiced actually, reducing the taxable income. So even if we can implement your proposal indeed to increase from 15 to 21% the global agreed tax rates, corporate tax rates, we also need to be sure that the tax base is not eroded via a whole range of existing loopholes that allow for the tax base to be eroded. And this is key if we want to allow developing countries to increase their typical tax to GDP ratio, which is nowadays around 10-15%, and in developing countries is rather 30 to 50 and above % of GDP. So this is absolutely essential to enable those developing countries also to be able to raise domestic resources for that purpose.
Okay, Ralph, would you like to comment on the trade issue before we go to question of the floor? I mean, I know you are a specialist of the issue. Now we are talking about trade, which intervene in this context, not only in the way that Jill has been mentioning, but more broadly. Maybe I'll give you a few minutes, and then we'll go to a question of the.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to say a quick word on international trade, not so much trade in gold and things like that, but perhaps a big picture point. And the big picture point is really that most people think of trade as part of the problem when it comes to climate change. You know, when you think of trade, you think of transport. When you think of transport, you think of trucks and ships and planes and all the emissions that they cause. And I'm not saying this is not important. Of course, this is very important. But really, trade is an important part of the solution. And to see this, you need to recognize that trade-related emissions are not just coming from the actual transport of goods, but also from the production of goods. And there's a lot of variation in production emissions across countries that international trade helps you exploit. And the main point is a very simple one. If you've taken an international trade class, I'm sure you've learned about the gains from trade and the power of comparative advantage. And the idea is very simple. So, you get economic gains from trade if countries specialize in what they're relatively good at. And what I'm arguing is that you can also have environmental gains from trade. And you get these environmental gains from trade if you specialize in what you're relatively green at. And the difference, though, between the economic gains from trade and the environmental ones is that the environmental gains from trade need some help. In particular, you need some policy that internalizes the externalities that are causing the climate problem to begin with. And we've done a simulation, so it's just a quantitative trade model in which we correct the carbon externality by imposing a global carbon price just for illustrative purposes. And what you see is, well, carbon emissions go down, that's not so interesting, but more than 1/3 of this effect is due to these environmental gains from trade, which means, in effect, the trade is a very important force multiplier for carbon mitigation policies. And I think that's a very important point, because if you look at the policy discussion, you know, often these environmental policies are not really crafted, I think, with their trade implications in mind, and which is understandable, of course, because they're made by environmental policymakers who are first and foremost concerned about the environment. But if you realize that it's really important also to preserve trade, not just for the economic well-being of people, but also for the environment itself, I think it's important to take this kind of more holistic approach. And let me say one last thing. So in this simulation that we've done, we take technology as given. But if you think about also technological change and what's all possible, I mean, think about the map that Esther showed you at where it's all hot and what kind of countries these are, and think about the potential for renewable energy generation, and think about what this means for natural comparative advantages. So where should energy-intensive industries, for example, be located? Presumably in countries that have a natural advantage in producing green energy. And then instead of shipping the energy itself and worrying about how difficult it is to build, you know, cables from Africa to Europe, for example, why not just ship the energy-intensive goods and therefore the kind of renewable energy embedded in these products? So really the main point, think of trade as being part of the solution if it's well done.
Thank you very much. Quentin, tell us.
So we
what
have
is coming from the floor.
We have more than 100 questions. So, but there is one very popular. So I want to start with this one and then maybe take a few more, if you allow me, Jean-Pierre. The first one is about degrowth, which echoes everything we're discussing here. Is it necessary?
Who wants to tackle that question?
So I think there is a bit of a growth fetishism in general. I am not very interested in growth as an object for two reasons, because it all depends how it's distributed and who gets it, and also because we don't know how to affect it anyways. I think one thing that we've learned from macroeconomics is that macroeconomists they can tell us what not to do to destroy growth, like avoid hyperinflation, that kind of thing. So some basic things we know, but beyond that, we just have no idea how to engineer growth, and I would sustain degrowth as well. So I think what's important is welfare and also protecting the planet. Growth would be a mean to an end, and I think it has tended to mislead us. But let me go one step further. In rich countries, we have plenty of resources, plenty of goods already, plenty of money, and then there is a huge question of how to share it equally. In very poor countries, they need more. There is no doubt about that. So if we could engineer growth in poor countries, one should. People, literally again, income is what protects people from dying when it's hot. To tell people, no, sorry, you have to do degrowth, it's just not possible when you're thinking about poor countries. That's what I was trying to say with the fact that even if we manage to reach the SDG 1, pollution emission would increase by 2%. So we can just, not talk so much about growth, talk about welfare, talk about what we want to achieve, what's a full life. First of all, it's to be alive and to have all of the different aspects of the SDG, going to school, having a good health, being able to have a career, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, and so on. And that's this is less, and then in the middle of that, protect the planet. And it's less, it's longer to say than growth or degrowth. It is not like one kind of headline number. But it has the advantage of being things that we can actually influence. So, for example, rather than think about degrowth in the West, for example, we could think about how about making sure that everybody can use public transport to go where they want to be. You know, what matters is not degrowth, what matters is how much we emit. How about making sure that nobody takes a private jet to do 200 kilometers? And then it becomes, you know, very concrete.
Thank you very much. I cannot underline more than that. I fully agree with that, and I think it's very good that we had that question and we had that answer. But let me give the floor to Özge, who obviously wants to say more.
No, thank you so much. I just want to share maybe also a recent sort of event we had, and again, I mean, I'm here also to represent the United Nations, so it's about the perspective. You know, it's interesting in the 13, 14 plus years I've been in that space, how actually not the notion of degrowth per se, but actually this aspect of moving beyond GDP has become something that actually we talk about. And as I said, I did work for an IFI before. I'm not going to say which one it is, but you can go on my LinkedIn, you will find it out. But I remember, you know, working in this European IFI. Again, I'm giving you a bit more clue. Starting to sort of introduce this aspect of economic inclusion was already quite revolutionary. And I think this aspect of, Esther, I just wanted to amplify and re-emphasize again what you said. Can we think about ways of measuring what matters by actually putting well-being into the center? Because when you look at GDP as a measure, it does measure economic progress, not necessarily how it's being distributed, but it does not measure what type of well-being is being produced for people and planet. And I think what is quite interesting, if you ask me on a personal note, what's going to happen, I do not have the crystal ball. What I can tell you, though, is at least in the framework of the United Nations, this aspect of going beyond GDP, again, by developing alternative indicators to measure what actually creates value, is part of a pact that's going to be negotiated at the Summit of the Future in September in New York. And I think if we manage to get that done, that could be a very interesting point of at least not speaking about degrowth, but how we do move beyond GDP. I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Okay, I know you have other questions, Quentin, but Ralph would like to intervene. In a sense, maybe one way to bounce back is to talk about the international organization and what will be their responsibilities in this prospect or in this project that Esther has outlined, and in general, we do have representatives of international organizations. They are really on the spot in this big scheme of things. We have a responsibility how to address it. I don't know if that's what you wanted to talk about, but I give you the floor.
I'm not going to be long. I just wanted to quickly comment on the degrowth point from a slightly different angle, which is one of the economic costs of the carbon mitigation measures, because I do actually think it's extremely important that we achieve the carbon mitigation and more generally the green transition at the smallest economic cost. So that's not so much degrowth, but it still means kind of taking the economic consequences of our climate policies into account. And for the simple fact that otherwise it's just not going to happen. And we see it in many countries. If you have a carbon price, if things start to get expensive, if things start to get economically challenging, people are starting to protest, and that undermines the feasibility of these climate policies. Which brings me to another very, very quick point, which is really, you know, this is really the point where I think economists are needed in the debate, because that's one thing we are quite good at, I think, is to use, for example, market-based solution and propose market-based solutions to actually reduce the costs of climate change mitigation. So I just wanted to advocate for our role in the debate.
Very good. Let's go to the public, okay, to the audience.
So one of the main questions is also about compliance. How do you make the richest care? Why do they seem to care so little? But also about compliance on the global level, and all the countries working together, avoiding having just solution when you can evade by going in one specific place and not enforcing globally.
Okay, so that's a general question of feasibility in a world where we are not all on the same plane. Right? I mean, we are again fighting against each other in some places. How hopeful are you that indeed we can get these kinds of agreement? This is a bit related to my question about the force of international organization in getting us to this kind of solution.
I think he might know better than me because he's been in that. So I think you probably should take that question.
No, I think just to go from the last question to this question, it's interesting to see at the level of corporate reporting efforts now with science target for nature, science-based target for nature, and different frameworks where we see asks to companies to report first on their CO2 emissions and to see what kind of roadmap they take to net zero. And the question of compensation, how it's calculated, but we see now also with biodiversity, with water use, with the need to go towards a nature positive economy and to have clear targets and measures and ways to capture that. And in a way, it's a bit depressing to see that the GDP discussion that has been there for decades now to say, well, we have environmental accounting, we have capital approaches and looking at how natural capital get depleted and repleted has not progressed more in still conversation about GDP growth and at the macro level. So I think elements are there, but there is certainly a push necessary. Now at the global level, avoiding loopholes, it's well, in our research on precisely the question of trade mispricing and illicit financial flows eroding the tax base of countries like Ghana, what is interesting is to say, well, Ghana has been invited by the OECD. They were said, well, you will be, kind of a full participant, but not a member. But they felt that they had no real say, and that the complexity of what was proposed under the BEPS project, etc., is very hard to implement because they don't have the means and the resources to do so. And what is important, I think, if we have stronger processes under the UN, but also under African-led processes nowadays, is to let some leeways in terms of once we are agreeing on the objective, how it is implemented locally based on the institutional capacities and the reality that prevails on the ground. And this is something that is key. And then finally, I think there is more, it's a political question to say, well, once we have established and agreed on a framework, let's not start doing too much of a Swiss cheese with too many holes with it leaks, because then we lose, even if we are still agreeing with the letter of what has been agreed, we lose completely the spirit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to go for another question, or should I go with mine?
I have one more.
Okay,
At least one more. I think an important one that we observe the consequence today that is also very high in the list is about migration and the consequence of climate change on migration in context, how it affects policies and this equilibrium. Is it a relief possible to allow people from escaping those places, but does it put more pressure elsewhere? So basically, how do you approach this issue today and how it relates to the potential policies you presented?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And I'm sort of purposefully leaving it aside in the basic discussion because I think it's neither here nor there. We should not do this because it's going to have an effect on migration. But and also because I kind of don't like the argument that do this. I don't want to be playing the game that this should be played because that's going to reduce migration, because I don't think that's we should encourage this kind of discussions. But the truth is that today only about, in any given year, about 3% of the population is a migrant, of the world population is a migrant. So that sounds huge, but that's, sometimes we have the perception that there are so many migrants, but really there are not that many. And most people very much prefer to be home. And people do not leave home because they want to get a bit more money elsewhere, even when there are no constraints. For example, within the European Union, when there was a big crisis in Greece, it's not that everybody left Greece, or people could make more money in France than in Spain, but they stayed in Spain. So mostly people are not leaving home. They like to be home. And within countries, we see that as well. For example, in the US, one of the big reasons why the international trade has been so costly on some regions, people are kind of reluctant to leave them, even though there would be other jobs for them to get elsewhere. So on balance, actually, what is striking is how little people move in response to changes in the world that make certain locations more desirable than others. And what this means is that people would prefer to stay in their house, in their home, if they could at all. And if we're thinking about these climate shocks and thinking, some people are completely going to lose wherever they are is going to be underwater, they'll have to move. But other people, they would be able to stay home if they were supported when they stay home, and then a lot of people would prefer to stay home, and they would only leave when home pushes them away. And finding ways to support people, either at home or for temporary migration to the nearest city, as opposed to, which is, when people migrate, usually they migrate like close by, equip the cities to receive those migrants, both in terms of infrastructure and jobs and so on, would actually be a way of making everybody better off in terms of people being able to stay home or close to home, and people in our type of country who are terrified of migrants for wrong reason, in my opinion, but it is what it is, to not have to, that we don't have to, it's not that the migrants want to come, they would rather be home if they could at all. So I think that would definitely help potential big migration movement due to climate disasters.
Okay, what do we do? Do you want one more?
I have one more perfectly to finish the session, so maybe you can go first, and then we ask this one.
Well, first of all, I thought, I know we have to be pragmatic, but if we have a lot more resources, shouldn't we also spend a bit more at home in order to prevent climate change? After all, we are the one polluting.
Oh, we totally should, but just not that money. That money is not, we do, that money is the money that we owe to poor country because we're killing them. So that is one side. Then we actually absolutely need to raise money for climate mitigation, be my guest. That's not what I'm trying to raise with that.
But there is a tension there, inevitably, right? Of course, maybe not if we manage to get the billionaire to pay, but we know that we are in a country where there is a proposal to decrease taxes. And of course, maybe if we were thinking about preventing climate change, we should rather use the tax money that we have in order to do what we should be doing. But okay, that's my take. The other question I think that we should do, we didn't talk at all about private money. And what is your view? You have three pillars, but it all goes through government tax money going to the private or to international organization. Is there no role for private finance or maybe public-private partnership in finance in order to help out poor countries?
Again, not in that bucket. There is nobody to be made. There's no money to be made. There is a lot of social return to keep people alive, but nobody is going to make money out of it. This is, in a sense, this is also where I think that I'm trying to, another roadblock that I'm trying to get to kind of bulldoze through with this idea of, let's identify new sources of tax revenues, is that the way the climate conversation goes, I'm slightly caricaturing it, but is the poor country says, hey, you guys are doing this to us, you owe us a lot of money, and the rich country says, that's too much money, we have to use the private sector. And then private sector. And then you saw it on my graph. Private sector, they're happy spending the money, but they have to get it back. So they will give loans, they will take equity, they will only participate in projects where they can make money out of. paying direct transfer to a poor person, they are not going to make money out of
The kind
that.
of project that Ralph was talking about, of course, could be
Yes,
profitable.
but that's not the ones I'm talking about.
Okay.
Again, I think we really need to understand that mitigation is one thing. It's one thing we need to do. But it's the only thing we have even spoken about until now, until the loss and damage fund, discussion and the 700 million we were able to kind of generate for it. We still need to do it, absolutely. Like no doubt about that. We need to do it here. We need to do it there. We need to, price the forest in Gabon and in Malaysia and so on. All of that we need to do. But in the meantime, we have that. This is the fine that we owe because we are polluting the atmosphere. There is no private person is willingly going to go and give the money. One caveat, and this is related to your feasibility thing. I do think if billionaires are in their right mind, they should really want to pay 2% of their wealth for this, because they need this, the world to function. This is not a very high price to pay. So I kind of hope that not all of them, but some of them would endorse something like that. It doesn't seem like, it's not a revolution. Huh? It's very, very reasonable.
I hope you're right. Go ahead.
No, it's just something I wanted to share with you that I also learned a few weeks ago. It's a very interesting question, this thing about care. Why do we care? How do we care? Incentives. And someone told me from a business school in France, actually a friend of mine who's managing the Hoffman Institute for Business Society, she said, Özge, you should start talking to family-owned businesses, family-owned businesses. Because something that you mentioned, which as a Swiss person, I obviously can just testify on that. We have a very high density of very wealthy people here in this country. And interesting enough, there is a lot of people also that have this tradition of businesses that they have inherited, assets that they have inherited from families. And interesting enough, these people, again, I'm not talking about everyone and anyone under the sun, but there is a sense of care. And what I mentioned also before about this aspect of generations to come. And they do invest in nature-based solutions, for example, because I do believe that they have just a higher sense of responsibility. The question I'm very interested in is to understand what type of incentive structures and then also accountability structures we must and can put in place to have people care. Ultimately, and on that one, last but not least, I also moved on. I used to care about why people care. By now, I don't really care why they care, as long as they care. So I think that's what we need to look at.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll go for the conclusion, since we have less than 10 minutes left.
Perfect. So that was a perfect timing, because you really actually answered some of the top questions. But there are two more that I think will be fair to ask now. First, and one last after to conclude, maybe a very popular question here is what individuals can do, what people in the room here can do to act and to help.
In a sense, I would say there is this French saying, this is a Voltaire says, cultivate your garden. So first of all, cultivate your actual garden, that's helpful. Grow your vegetable and so on. But more, taking it to the metaphor is, there must be, that's what Sébastien was saying also, is in my work, I've always tried to identify one small thing at a time and kind of go for it. And sometimes the problems look so big, and with climate there is that tendency of getting like really despondent and depressed and saying there's nothing I can do. But when I started working on global poverty, the same, you had a feeling that nothing had improved. It was there were so many kids dying before their first birthday, and so many extraordinarily poor people, and you can easily get depressed. Or you can say, well, let me cut this big problem into many small problems, find a small problem that is my small problem, and make progress on it. And I don't know what your small problem is, so I'm not going to give you an advice of this is more important than that. But I think this is, first of all, at a very selfish level, this is a very fulfilling way to lead your life because you're making, progress one step at a time. And second of all, you turn back after 30 years of being in this business and say, well, something did happen. And the reality is for a lot of people across the board, the mundanity of daily life might seem kind of that it's nothing compared to the challenge we have, but in reality, it kind of adds up. So that would be my advice. And it was not very representative with that because I'm going after, in a sense, a big question. But even then I'm trying to make it I'm trying to kind of do away with the noise and the big plan and say, well, there is these two things, 15 to 21, 2% wealth tax. Let's see where that takes us. And that also creates a little bit of momentum because people can latch on to something. So that
Let me give a complementary answer because I cannot escape. We have a room full of young people. The one thing is vote. At least in Switzerland, you have a chance to change things, but we have to do it through the system, and that's by voting. Next question.
So maybe the last that we can ask to each participant, yes. And I'll try to phrase it as it's phrased here. Do you think it's too late for us to save the situation? Would you like to start?
No, I mean, I was just...
Well, it's one answer is the kind of thing you're talking about. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's not going to happen from one day to the next, right? And of course, on that score, you could say, it's really bad. We need to go quickly, and it's going to be very, very hard. So maybe that's an answer. It's too late. At the same time, it's never too late. I mean, we've got to go for what we can do. Any other answer?
Go ahead, I can.
No, I think the question whether it's too late, no, things have already happened. We are speaking of climate change adaptation. Actually, working in the Sahel for the past 20 years, it was there already. Climate change was there. A lot of the relief program we were having and were related to more recurrent droughts. We didn't call it climate change adaptation. We call it like that. It helps us get the money, but but it was there. It's intensifying, and it's not too late in a sense that of course we should have acted upon this way before and with much more in a resolute manner. But I think at every level we can really act. And one question maybe for you, Esther, is that I really appreciate very much what you said about each of us with our garden, and let's start with that. At the same time, I see sometimes our students, they get a bit discouraged because it's complex adaptive systems, and we get lost in complexity and then discouraged. And sometimes we say, but where should I plant the needle if I'm doing acupuncture? Where can I plant some of these needles to really activate systems change, and instead of adding pilots to pilots, doing something which is more a bit radical? That's certainly what we have done also by promoting, this way in development economics to try to test out what works, what doesn't, and try to replicate what seems to work and have an impact. And this is certainly something we need, but maybe this would be quite interesting because there's also questions that our students are asking. Okay, there are so many things I could try to invest in, but what has a systems change impact that can, really catch up with the sense of we are very late and there is a sense of urgency and we must be effective now?
That looks very much like a concluding statement, Gilles. Very, very, thank you very much. But and then I'll give it to Ralph for his key message. What do you take from this session? What are you going to send as a message back to the world?
I wasn't gonna go for that grand of an intervention. I just wanted to respond to the is it too late question, and in particular build on what Esther said, which I found so inspiring, to say, you know, if things are overwhelming and you have this big problem in front of you, you know, look at pass it into smaller ones and identify the one that's yours. And I think in my case, the one that's mine at the moment, or at least the one that I'm working on together with all my colleagues at the WTO, is how to make sure that, you know, climate action doesn't lead to trade tensions, or at least not to unnecessary trade tensions. And even that smaller problem, you know, you sometimes get disheartened if you read the news. But then you keep pushing, and you know, just as a message of hope, just today we had a meeting of the Council on Trade and Environment, and the United States government submitted a proposal that the WTO should play a more active role in coordinating climate mitigation policies around the world, and making sure they don't lead to unnecessary trade tensions. I'm paraphrasing a little bit now, but things are happening. Things are happening in Geneva. The Secretariat is working on things. Our members are coming together working on things. So those are the things that make me hopeful.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Özge, the last word for you.
Yeah, I also want to end. Actually, it's a very good way, I think, of ending at the discussion. You know, it's interesting because I'm a pessimist in my personal life and an optimist in my work. So when I'm here, I'm obviously here to also share a message of hope. But, you know, truth to be told, when you are in these positions, I think that people look up to you for solutions, and that's our role, to provide solutions. But we also don't have the crystal ball. I do not know how things will pan out. But one thing I know is on this aspect of too late, it's interesting that actually, particularly because we didn't really name it, but if we can be very honest in this room, off the record, Chatham House, as much as it gets, but, you know, yes, maybe we can, but, you know, the fossil fuel industry, for a long time, there was this sort of endeavor to make the evidence go away, which obviously hasn't happened. You know, evidence is so strong, you can't anymore deny that the way how we burn carbon, the way how we, you know, run our economies, get the energy from, is just not compatible with the planetary boundaries. It's the framework we live in, what sustains us and life. We're part of life, of Earth. So it's being then moving the narrative into it's too late. So when I read about this, it actually gave me hope. It gave me hope. It is perhaps too late for certain things, but it's not too late to prevent the worst to come. And I think for myself, and you know, you also spoke about this, I have really the privilege to be doing something that is action-oriented, and it gives me actually hope through what I do. But I really want to share that passion also with you. And I think one thing I wanted to just ask you is, because you guys are economic students, I mean, I think you have so much power to change the way we do economy, and you have so much power to rethink our systems. And for those who are interested, what I really recommend to check out is a partner of ours. They're called Rethinking Economics. It's a UK-based but worldwide movement. Some of you may know. They're really working on some incredible stuff, because economics is a very strong paradigm in the way how we actually go about climate change. A lot of what climate change is about is driven by the economy. So you can make a difference, use it.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for your participation. I cannot not say that we are rethinking economics at the University of Lausanne, at EPFL, and at IMD through Enterprise for Society. So you can read, you can contribute by working with us. Yes, there is hope. Thank you very much for these messages. And I give you the floor, Quentin, for the...
So maybe one last word to conclude. Indeed, to echo what you just said. I think tonight illustrated very well two facts, two things. That first, there are no simple answers. And hence, academia, our university, plays an important role into contributing to how to answer those questions. And we should remind how important it is our role to contribute to answering those key questions today and support society. But second, we cannot do this alone. We need to take this research, to communicate, to exchange with all the stakeholders, to maximize the usefulness of research and of what we do in academia through education, communication, and partnerships. So For that being said, thank you very much again, Professor Duflo, for illustrating this, showing that it's feasible. And a big round of applause. So thank you for leading the way. Thank you to the University of Lausanne for sharing those values, for organizing with HEC Lausanne this event tonight. And of course, thank you to the panelists for dedicating their work to this mission. And finally, last but definitely not least, thank you to all of you for being here. As I said, it's necessary that we all work together, and you are part of the solution. So thank you very much and have a pleasant evening.